Chapter 1. The Invisible Void. When you look back on your early years, your mind likely immediately jumps to the tangible moments. You probably remember the vivid highs and the sharp lows. You might recall the bright sting of a scraped knee, the triumphant rush of riding a bicycle for the first time, or the tension of a sudden argument echoing down the hallway. These are the visible brushstrokes on the canvas of your history. But there is something else, something far more powerful, that shapes who you are today. It is not what happened to you. It is what failed to happen. It is the profound, shaping silence of the things you do not remember, because they were never there to be recorded in the first place. There is a hidden weight carried by countless capable, successful, and seemingly thriving individuals. You might be one of them. You might have a career that commands respect, a comfortable home, and a circle of people who care for you. From the outside, your life looks pristine. Yet, in the quiet moments between the rush of your daily obligations, a persistent, unanswerable question arises. Why do I feel so unfulfilled? You might look at the people around you and wonder how they seem to experience life in full color, while you feel as though you are observing the world through a pane of frosted glass. You might harbor a secret belief that you are somehow fundamentally flawed, that you are just going through the motions, or that you are an imposter waiting to be unmasked. When you look to your past for an explanation, you find nothing obviously traumatic. Your caregivers provided food, shelter, and perhaps even a great deal of freedom and material comfort. Because you cannot find a villain in your past, you inevitably turn the blame inward, deciding that this lingering emptiness is entirely your own fault. This phenomenon is not a personal failing. It is the result of an invisible force that is incredibly common, yet rarely discussed or named. That force is a subtle, chronic absence of emotional validation. It is the white space in your family portrait. While physical neglect is obvious, like a child shivering without a winter coat, emotional absence leaves no visible bruises. It hides in the everyday moments. It dwells in the sins of omission rather than commission. Imagine a young child sitting at the kitchen table struggling with a difficult assignment. The child begins to cry out of sheer frustration. A caregiver walks into the room, notices the tears, and immediately offers a plate of warm cookies to make the child feel better. To an outside observer, this is a picture of profound love and care. The child is fed, the child is comforted. But what did not happen in that moment? The caregiver did not sit down, look the child in the eye, and say that they understand how infuriating it feels to be stuck. The caregiver did not name the emotion. The child learns that when frustration arises, it should be swallowed down and covered up with a distraction, rather than understood and managed. The child's physical needs were met beautifully, but their emotional need was completely overlooked. When this happens repeatedly, day after day, year after year, the child learns that their inner world is irrelevant. If you relate to this, you might notice specific echoes in your adult life. You might pride yourself on your fierce independence, going to extreme lengths to avoid asking anyone for help. You might find it far easier to extend deep compassion to a struggling friend than to offer even a fraction of that grace to yourself. You might feel a mystifying urge to simply be left alone, harboring a deep-seated belief that if people truly got to know the real you, they would turn away. These are not character defects. They are the perfectly logical adaptations of a person who was forced to raise their own emotional self. You were taught to run on a completely empty tank. To understand how this happens, we must look at the blueprint of a healthy emotional foundation. A secure, thriving adult is built by caregivers who are just good enough. Perfection is not required, nor is it possible. What is required is a basic, consistent presence built on 3 pillars. First, the caregiver must feel a genuine emotional connection to the child. Second, they must pay attention, seeing the child not as an extension of themselves, but as a unique, separate individual. Third, they must use that attention to respond competently to the child's emotional needs. Let us consider how this looks in the real world. Think of a teenager who comes home after being humiliated by a teacher in front of the entire class. The teenager walks through the door, slams their backpack on the floor, and snaps aggressively at their parent. A parent who is disconnected might instantly react to the disrespect, issuing a harsh punishment and sending the teenager to their room. The behavior is addressed, but the underlying pain is ignored. Conversely, an emotionally attuned parent notices the heavy footsteps and the rigid posture. They recognize that the sudden anger is a shield for deep hurt. This parent will set a boundary against the disrespect, but they will simultaneously seek the source of the pain, creating a safe harbor for the teenager to process their humiliation. This is how a human being learns to untangle their own heart. It is vital to recognize that all good parents miss the mark sometimes. Every caregiver becomes exhausted, distracted, or overwhelmed. The damage we are exploring is not caused by the occasional lapse in patience or the normal frictions of family life. The deep, lasting impact occurs when there is a chronic, ongoing blindness to the child's inner world. It happens when the total sum of a child's emotional bids are met with silence, misinterpretation, or dismissal over the course of their formative years. If you are a parent yourself, realizing that your own childhood lacked this fundamental fuel can bring a wave of sudden, heavy guilt. You might immediately begin to scan your own interactions with your children, terrified that you have passed this invisible void down to them. Let that guilt wash over you and then let it go. You cannot pass on a language you were never taught to speak. The fact that you are engaging with this realization means you are already breaking the cycle. Awareness is the light that banishes the invisible force. You are stepping out of the white space and learning to see the picture clearly. Chapter 2. The Accidental Blind Spots. We naturally want the sources of our deepest pain to be obvious. We look for dramatic villains who operated with clear malice, assuming that a lingering, pervasive sense of adult emptiness must have been caused by an overt childhood trauma. But in the complex landscape of family life, the most profound wounds are rarely inflicted intentionally. They are almost always the result of accidental blind spots. When we trace the origins of an adult who is running on an empty emotional tank, we usually find caregivers who were restricted by their own unspoken limitations, their own untreated pain, or their own rigid coping mechanisms. These caregivers often love their children fiercely and provide beautifully for their physical needs, yet they remain entirely unaware that they are starving their children emotionally. Consider the environment built by a caregiver who treats their child not as a separate, breathing human being, but as an extension of themselves. In this household, the child's primary purpose is to reflect beautifully upon the family, boosting the caregiver's own fragile sense of superiority. Picture a young girl who has practiced tirelessly for months to perform a complex piano sonata. On the night of the recital, the pressure mounts, her fingers slip, and she forgets a crucial stanza. She leaves the stage in hot, humiliated tears, desperate for a comforting embrace. Instead of meeting her in her pain, her caregiver bristles with cold anger, viewing the child's mistake as a personal public embarrassment. The child is scolded not for her lack of effort, but for making the family look foolish. In that devastating moment, a profound lesson is etched into her mind. She learns that her worth is entirely conditional and that her true, vulnerable feelings are an unacceptable nuisance that must be hidden away. She will likely enter adulthood as a high-achieving perfectionist who secretly feels like a fraud, terrified that any misstep will result in total rejection. Then there is the environment defined by unyielding rigidity, where strict obedience is the only recognized currency of love. Imagine a teenage boy who is invited to spend a major holiday with a new partner's family, a milestone he is deeply excited to experience. When he respectfully asks his guardian for permission to miss the traditional, highly structured family dinner, the response is a sudden, crushing explosion of guilt and rage. The guardian interprets the boy's natural, healthy desire for independence as a malicious act of disrespect and personal rejection. The boy is told he is selfish, ungrateful, and unloving. To keep the peace and secure his guardian's affection, he cancels his plans, swallowing his own desires. He learns that having personal needs is offensive, and he is trained to silently prioritize the demands of authority figures over his own legitimate joy. He will walk into his adult relationships completely disconnected from his own desires, endlessly catering to others while wondering why he feels so hollow. On the absolute opposite end of the spectrum is the environment of infinite freedom, guided entirely by the path of least resistance. This caregiver avoids conflict at all costs, finding it infinitely easier to look the other way than to set a firm boundary or enforce a consequence. Picture a high school student who begins skipping classes, staying out late, and failing exams. Instead of investigating the root of the behavior or doing the painful work of discipline, the caregiver simply smiles, accepts the flimsiest of excuses, and says they just want the teenager to be happy. The teenager feels incredibly loved and enjoys the lack of friction in the moment, but a developing human mind needs a strong wall to push against to understand its own shape and limitations. Because the caregiver avoids the exhausting work of parenting, the child enters the adult world completely unequipped for its real-world demands. When this adult eventually struggles to maintain a career or navigate a complex relationship, they look back at their seemingly perfect, frictionless childhood and conclude that they must simply be broken, entirely unaware that they were denied the crucial friction required for growth. Sometimes the blind spot is created by a shadow that swallows the caregiver whole, such as profound grief or a deep, chronic depression. In these homes, the caregiver is physically present but emotionally missing in action. Consider a household shattered by the sudden loss of a spouse or a devastating financial ruin. The surviving parent enters a state of perpetual survival mode, maintaining the physical necessities of life by paying the bills and cooking the meals, but shutting down completely on the inside to survive the crushing weight of their pain. A young boy in this house quickly learns that any display of need, sadness, or even boisterous joy might tip his fragile parent over the edge. He learns to shrink himself. He stops sharing his fears and his triumphs. He becomes a master of reading the room and ensuring he is never a burden to the person who is supposed to be carrying him. As he grows older, he carries a deep, heavy numbness, feeling as though he exists on the outside of life looking in, permanently disconnected from the vibrant, breathing reality of the world around him. Finally, consider the agonizing unpredictability of the functional addict. This is rarely the dramatic caricature of addiction we see in films. Often, it is the beloved community figure, the hard-working provider, or the charming host who relies on a substance or a compulsion to cope with the evening hours. Picture a daughter who listens to the front door open every afternoon with a spike of adrenaline. If her parent has not yet engaged in their compulsion, the house is warm, encouraging, and supportive. But once the behavior begins, the atmosphere shifts completely. The parent becomes mocking, highly critical, or volatile. The daughter grows up walking on eggshells, her nervous system chronically hijacked by the need to anticipate which version of her parent she is dealing with that day. She learns that love is unpredictable, conditional, and inherently dangerous. She enters her adult relationships waiting for the other shoe to drop, plagued by an anxiety she cannot explain and a deep-seated belief that safety is always an illusion. In every one of these scenarios, the caregivers likely loved their children deeply. They provided shelter, food, and physical safety. Yet their own emotional blind spots created an environment where the child's inner world was slowly, quietly starved. But these are only the most visible of the accidental blind spots. There are other, even more subtle environments where caregivers unknowingly extinguish a child's emotional spark. Places where society actually applauds the very behaviors that cause the deepest invisible wounds. Chapter 3. The Hidden Disconnects. There are environments that quietly starve a child's emotional world while society stands by and applauds. When we think of neglect, we rarely picture a sprawling, beautifully manicured home, a driveway filled with luxury cars, or a family that commands respect and admiration in the community. Yet some of the deepest emotional voids are created under the guise of success, responsibility, or even profound sacrifice. In these homes, the disconnect is entirely hidden beneath a polished surface, leaving the child confused by their own internal suffering. Because everything looks so perfect on the outside, the child assumes their persistent unhappiness is a sign of their own ungrateful nature. Consider the home built by relentless, consuming labor. We live in a culture that venerates the tireless worker, the parent who climbs the corporate ladder, builds an empire, and provides a life of immense material privilege. But within the walls of that home, the child experiences a profound and echoing absence. Imagine a young boy sitting on the edge of a pristine athletic field, scanning the bleachers for a familiar face, only to find the nanny sitting there once again. His parent is miles away, closing another crucial deal, providing for the family's future. The parent truly believes that financial security is the ultimate expression of love. But a child cannot emotionally bond with a bank account or a prestigious title. The child learns that their parents' work is the undeniable center of the universe, and their own small life, their games, their fears, their daily triumphs, is a distant secondary priority. As this boy grows into an adult, surrounded by the finest things, he will grapple with a crushing, inexplicable depression. He will look at his affluent upbringing and brutally scold himself for feeling so empty, completely unaware that he was orphaned by success. Closely tied to the currency of relentless work is the environment defined by an unquenchable thirst for achievement. In this household, the parent views the child as a project to be perfected. Imagine a high school student who stays awake until the early hours of the morning, painstakingly studying to maintain a flawless academic record. She brings home a glowing report card, hoping for a moment of warm, unconditional celebration. Instead, her parent immediately scrutinizes the single grade that falls short of perfection, asking how they can fix it for the next term or how this slight dip might impact a future university application. The parent believes they are pushing the child toward a brilliant future, but the child absorbs a devastating lesson. She is only as valuable as her latest accomplishment. Her true, messy, human self is utterly irrelevant. Only her output matters. She will become an adult who cannot stop running, constantly chasing the next promotion or accolade, terrified that if she ever stops achieving, she will cease to be worthy of love. Then there are the disconnects born not of ambition, but of quiet, overwhelming tragedy. Imagine a family where one member requires all the available oxygen in the room. Perhaps a sibling is battling a severe chronic illness, or a parent is paralyzed by a debilitating physical condition. The healthy child in this environment looks around and intuitively understands that the family is constantly operating at the absolute edge of its capacity. This child decides, silently and heroically, to become the rock. They stop asking for help with their homework. They swallow their own tears when a friend betrays them. They smile and tell their exhausted parents that everything is perfectly fine. The parents, desperate for a reprieve, accept this facade with profound relief, often praising the healthy child for being so exceptionally low maintenance and mature. But children are not meant to be self-sustaining. This heroic child bypasses a vital developmental stage, burying their own legitimate needs so deeply that they forget how to access them. As an adult, they will be utterly incapable of asking a partner for support, feeling a deep, quiet resentment as they endlessly care for everyone around them, while slowly starving to death emotionally. Sometimes, this dynamic shifts into a complete role reversal, where the child is forced to become the parent. Due to overwhelming financial strain, addiction, or illness, the parent simply abdicates their role. Picture a 10-year-old girl who walks home from school, unlocks the front door, and immediately begins preparing dinner for her younger siblings. She manages the bedtime routines, breaks up the fights, and ensures the doors are locked, all while her parent is either absent or incapacitated. The parent relies on her completely. She is robbed of the carefree, protected era of childhood, forced to carry the crushing weight of adult responsibility before her shoulders are broad enough to bear it. She will grow into a hyper-competent adult who feels entirely disconnected from her own desires, navigating life with a heavy, joyless efficiency, wondering why the world feels so incredibly burdensome. Perhaps the most confusing and damaging environment of all is the one controlled by a parent entirely lacking in empathy or a conscience. This caregiver views human relationships exclusively through the lens of power and control. Imagine a young man who finally gathers the courage to confront his parent about a deeply hurtful, manipulative remark made at a family gathering. Instead of listening, the parent effortlessly twists the narrative, aggressively playing the victim and accusing the young man of being selfish and cruel. The next morning, the parent acts as though nothing happened, serving breakfast with a cheerful smile, demanding the son participate in the illusion that everything is perfectly normal. The son's reality is constantly shattered. He is trained to doubt his own memory, his own sanity, and his own worth. He will spend his adult life taking on massive, unearned guilt, twisting himself into knots, trying to explain and accommodate the inexplicable cruelty of the people he loves. Yet, of all the environments that leave a child running on empty, the most common is also the most ordinary. It is the home of the well-meaning parent. These parents are not sociopathic. They are not obsessed with achievement, and they are not burdened by extreme tragedy. They are loving, dedicated, and doing their absolute best. But they have a fatal blind spot. They are entirely disconnected from the emotional layer of life because they were never taught it themselves. Imagine a child who comes home from school feeling a vague, heavy sadness. The well-meaning parent notices the child's drooping shoulders and immediately offers a practical solution, a new video game, a favorite snack, or a suggestion to go play outside. The parent wants the child to be happy, but they simply do not have the vocabulary to sit in the dark with their child and explore the sadness. They fix the surface and ignore the depths. This parent loves their child deeply, but loving a child is not the same as being in tune with them. Because the parent is blind to the rich, complex world of human emotion, the child's emotional self goes entirely unacknowledged. The cycle simply repeats itself, passing quietly from one generation to the next, not through malice, but through the tragic inheritance of an unspoken language. The child grows up with everything they could possibly need, except the very core of their own humanity. And as they enter adulthood, the echoes of that empty tank begin to manifest in quiet, devastating ways. Chapter 4. The Echoes of an Empty Tank. When you build a house, the foundation is everything. You can construct a breathtaking home with magnificent windows, soaring ceilings, and exquisite architecture. But if the foundation is cracked or poured unevenly, the entire structure remains perpetually at risk. A strong wind or a shifting tide could bring the whole beautiful facade tumbling down. Childhood is the foundation of the human mind. Many adults who grew up with an invisible emotional void look remarkably successful and entirely normal on the surface. They go to work, they raise families, and they build impressive lives, completely unaware of the structural flaw hidden beneath their floorboards. They have no idea that their childhood played a role in their current struggles, and instead they relentlessly blame themselves for feeling disconnected and unfulfilled. When the tank was never filled, the engine still tries to run, but the sounds it makes are different. It echoes. The first and most pervasive echo is a profound, lingering feeling of emptiness. This is rarely experienced as a dramatic, crushing depression. Rather, it is a chronic, quiet numbness. It can manifest as a literal, physical sensation of an empty space in your chest or your belly. Think of a person standing in the center of a crowded room, surrounded by lifelong friends who are celebrating a joyful milestone. This person smiles warmly, clinks glasses, and laughs precisely at the right cues. But inside there is a vast, echoing numbness. They watch the vibrant joy of the people around them as if they are watching a film in a foreign language they do not speak. They feel completely set apart, a permanent outsider pressing their hands against the glass of human experience. To fight this unbearable numbness, this person might turn to extreme thrill-seeking. They might chase the fierce adrenaline rush of jumping out of airplanes, racing motorcycles at dangerous speeds, or abandoning stable lives to move across the country on a whim. The sharp spike of a racing heart works miracles for a brief moment, but the second the parachute opens or the engine cuts off, the hollow ache returns. They are desperately trying to fill themselves up from the outside because the emotional substance that allows a child to connect to the world was simply never provided. The second echo is a fierce, almost aggressive refusal to lean on anyone else, a condition known as counter-dependence. While independence is the healthy ability to support oneself, counter-dependence is the absolute terror of being needy. Picture a capable professional who is drowning under the weight of a massive, high-stakes project while simultaneously navigating a sudden, devastating personal crisis. Their partner gently offers to take over all the household duties, and a loyal colleague volunteers to shoulder half the workload. Instead of feeling a wave of relief, this professional feels a sharp, defensive spike of panic. They push the help away immediately, insisting with a tight smile that they have everything perfectly under control. They will stay awake for 3 days straight, grinding their health into dust just to prove that they require no one. They wear their extreme self-reliance like a suit of impenetrable armor, completely unaware that this armor is slowly suffocating them. They absorbed a quiet, unspoken mandate in their youth. Do not have feelings, do not show vulnerability, and never, under any circumstances, need anything from anyone. The third echo distorts the mirror in which we view ourselves, creating an unrealistic self-appraisal. When a child is raised by caregivers who are deeply emotionally attuned, they learn who they are by seeing their true reflections in their parents' eyes. They are gently guided to understand their natural talents and to contextualize their struggles. Without this mirroring, an adult walks into the world with a fractured, incomplete identity. Consider an immensely talented artist who has spent a decade shifting relentlessly from graphic design to architecture to teaching, completely unable to settle or commit. Every time they face a minor setback in a new role, they immediately assume they are an absolute fraud who has finally been unmasked. Because they lack a solid foundation of self-knowledge, they paint their self-worth with broad, childlike strokes. They view a tiny critique as undeniable proof of their complete inadequacy, while brushing off genuine, hard-earned praise as mere politeness. They feel like a permanent misfit, a square peg frantically trying to carve off their own edges to fit into a round hole. The fourth echo is a tragic double standard, an endless well of compassion for everyone else, and an absolute drought of grace for oneself. Imagine a fiercely loyal friend sitting in a quiet coffee shop, listening intently as their companion weeps over a terrible, costly mistake. This person leans in, speaks with profound warmth, and expertly soothes their friend's shame, gently reminding them that to err is beautifully human. Yet, just an hour later, this exact same person drops their keys in a puddle on the way to their car and unleashes a vicious, brutal internal monologue. They silently berate themselves, calling themselves stupid, clumsy, and entirely useless. The profound empathy they draw from to heal the broken world around them instantly dries up the second they look in the mirror, because there was no adult present in their early years to help them understand their childhood missteps and to model the art of forgiveness. They became their own relentlessly harsh parent. They demand absolute perfection from themselves, paralyzed by anger whenever they fall short of an impossible standard. The final echo in this heavy chorus is the crushing burden of guilt and shame regarding one's own humanity. When a child's natural emotions are treated as a nuisance, ignored, or actively discouraged, the child learns that their feelings are offensive and wrong. Think of a loving partner waking up on a beautiful sunlit Saturday. Their family is healthy, their career is stable, and the day is completely free of obligations. Yet, an inexplicable heavy wave of sorrow washes over them. Instead of simply breathing through the sadness, a toxic, burning shame blooms in their chest. They frantically hide their tears, locking themselves in the bathroom, consumed by the terrifying familiar thought. What is profoundly wrong with me? I have a wonderful life. I have absolutely no excuse to be unhappy. They treat their own natural, human emotions as if they are a disease, a dirty secret that must be concealed from the world at all costs. These echoes are not character flaws, and they are not signs that you are permanently broken. They are the incredibly predictable, logical acoustics of a space that was left empty. They are the heavy adult symptoms of a child who had to raise their own heart in the dark. Chapter 5. The Secret Burdens We Carry. When the natural, spontaneous emotions of a child are consistently treated as an inconvenience, that child does not simply stop feeling. Instead, those emotions are driven underground, mutating in the dark into something much heavier. What begins as a quiet, internal shame eventually crystallizes into a fierce, self-directed anger. Imagine a highly capable professional returning to a quiet, empty apartment after a long, successful week. Instead of feeling relief, a sudden wave of inexplicable sadness washes over them. Because they were never taught to hold their sadness with grace, they instantly attack themselves for feeling it at all. They might open a bottle of wine, pouring glass after glass in a desperate attempt to either numb the sorrow or finally force it to the surface. When the tears eventually come, they are not met with self-compassion, but with profound disgust. They sit in the dark, furiously castigating themselves for their weakness, convinced that they are somehow uniquely broken. They endure this brutal cycle in absolute secrecy, wearing a flawless, cheerful mask the moment they step back out into the morning light. This self-hatred often calcifies into a deeply guarded central belief that colors every human interaction, the secret conviction of a fatal flaw. This is the silent, terrifying certainty that if anyone were to truly bypass your defenses and see the authentic, unvarnished reality of who you are, they would be immediately repulsed. Consider a person navigating a vibrant, blooming romance. They are incredibly charming, engaging, and attentive, keeping the relationship perfectly balanced on the surface. But the moment the partnership demands true, unguarded intimacy, the moment their partner asks them to reveal their deepest fears or rawest dreams, they panic. They instinctively sabotage the connection, picking a sudden fight or pulling away completely. They convince themselves that the breakup was inevitable, telling themselves that no one could possibly love the damaged goods hiding beneath their charming exterior. They prefer the familiar ache of loneliness to the devastating risk of being truly known and subsequently rejected. Because this person has been starved of deep emotional warmth, they often find themselves completely paralyzed when called upon to nurture others. Think of a devoted parent who works tirelessly to provide every material comfort for their family. They will build the treehouse, pay for the best tutors, and expertly bandage a scraped knee. Yet when their child comes to them weeping with a broken heart over a cruel betrayal by a best friend, this parent completely freezes. They are terrified by the raw, messy display of tears. Instead of pulling the child into a warm, silent embrace, they stiffen and immediately offer a barrage of practical, logical solutions. They explain how to confront the friend, or they suggest joining a new club to find better companions. They offer brilliant tactical advice, completely devoid of the emotional glue that actually heals a wounded heart. They keep their loved ones at arm's length, entirely uncomfortable with the vulnerable reality of being emotionally needed. This internal disconnect also ravages a person's ability to govern their own life, manifesting as a chronic, exhausting lack of self-discipline. We often view discipline as a rigid, punishing force, but true self-discipline is actually the ultimate act of self-love. It is the internalized voice of a caring parent saying, "I love you too much to let you harm your future." When a child is raised without consistent, loving boundaries, they never internalize that crucial, guiding voice. Imagine a brilliant, creative adult who is constantly on the verge of greatness but can never seem to finish a project. They sit down to complete the mundane, tedious tasks required for their success, but immediately surrender to the impulse to abandon the work for immediate pleasure, perhaps overspending online or binge-watching television. Then, hours later, they crush themselves with a brutally harsh internal critic, calling themselves lazy, scattered, and worthless. They ricochet wildly between total self-indulgence and vicious self-punishment, completely missing the steady, compassionate, and firm middle ground required to actually move forward. At the very core of these burdens lies a profound blindness to one's own internal state, a condition where the entire language of emotion is entirely foreign. When you spend a lifetime burying your feelings, they do not simply vanish. They become a pressure cooker, frequently leaking out as a constant low-grade irritability. Picture a dependable, hard-working neighbor who seems to snap at everyone. They yell at the barista for a minor mistake. They sigh aggressively when a colleague asks a simple question, and they feel a constant, simmering resentment toward the world. If you were to ask them why they are so angry, they would likely be genuinely mystified, insisting they are perfectly fine. They are completely unaware that their chronic irritation is actually the pressurized release of decades of unacknowledged grief, loneliness, and exhaustion. They push everyone away with their temper, deepening their own tragic isolation, entirely blind to the true source of their pain. When this isolation becomes absolute, it can lead to the darkest and most misunderstood secret of all, the quiet, persistent fantasy of simply disappearing. This is rarely born of a sudden, dramatic tragedy. Rather, it is the cumulative weight of carrying an empty tank for an entire lifetime. Imagine someone who seems to have a beautiful, enviable life sitting quietly in their living room on an ordinary Tuesday evening. The crushing numbness becomes so loud, the performance of daily normalcy so incredibly exhausting, that they begin to view death not as a tragedy, but as a deeply comforting safety net. They might never actively plan to harm themselves, but they soothe their profound exhaustion by imagining the quiet relief of no longer having to exist, of no longer having to pretend. They might fantasize about running away to a deserted cabin, severing all ties and letting the world forget them entirely. This is the ultimate tragic adaptation to a world where they were never taught how to truly connect. It is the heartbreaking consequence of a human being forced to survive without the very fuel required to feel alive. Chapter 6. The Mechanics of True Change. When you finally decide to confront the invisible voids in your life, you might imagine the journey ahead as a staircase. You picture yourself taking one deliberate step after another, rising steadily upward toward a healthier, more connected version of yourself. But true, lasting change rarely resembles a straight, unbroken climb. Instead, it is a rugged, unpredictable path filled with sudden drops and unexpected detours. Think of a person who decides, after a lifetime of remaining silent, to finally start expressing their boundaries in a demanding relationship. On Monday, they successfully state their needs and feel a profound, exhilarating sense of triumph. But by Wednesday, exhausted and stressed, they fall right back into their old pattern of quiet submission. If this person expects change to be perfectly linear, they will view this Wednesday retreat as a catastrophic failure. They will unleash a familiar wave of self-anger, viewing themselves as weak and incapable, and they might abandon the effort entirely. This is the very first trap of healing, the false expectation that a setback is a failure. Progress is actually built on a rhythm of fits and starts, typically consisting of 2 steps forward and 1 heavy step back. The step backward is not a sign that you are broken. It is a built-in, completely normal part of the human process of growth. To survive the backward steps, you must fiercely guard against self-anger, because that anger will immediately derail your momentum. You must also recognize that as you begin to change your deeply ingrained patterns, you will encounter a wall of pure, agonizing discomfort. When you start behaving differently, standing up for yourself or allowing yourself to feel long-buried sadness, it will feel alien and unsafe. Your own mind will scream at you to retreat to the familiar quiet numbness, because the numbness is what kept you safe as a child. Avoidance will call to you like a beautiful oasis in a punishing desert. But that oasis is a mirage, and you must walk straight through the terrifying discomfort if you ever want to reach genuine freedom. To navigate this wilderness, we have to fundamentally redefine how we view our own inner world. In many circles, society treats emotions as an embarrassing nuisance. We are taught to view feelings as messy, weak, or childish, assuming that the most intelligent, successful people operate on pure, cold logic. But biologically, this is entirely backward. We are not thinking machines that occasionally feel. We are feeling creatures who think. Long before the human brain developed the capacity for complex, rational thought, it evolved the limbic system to generate emotion. Feelings are an ancient, vital survival mechanism. They are as fundamental to your biology as your lungs or your heartbeat. Consider a person trying to navigate a treacherous, winding mountain road in the dead of night with the headlights completely turned off. This is what it means to live without emotional awareness. Emotions are the headlights. Fear exists to tell us when to run and protect ourselves from danger. Anger provides the sudden, aggressive surge of energy required to fight back against injustice or defend our boundaries. Sadness forces us to slow down and process the reality that we are losing something incredibly important to us. To cut yourself off from these signals is to drive through life completely blind, endlessly vulnerable to crashing because you have disabled your own internal warning system. When you spend decades ignoring these vital signals, the emotions do not simply evaporate. They are driven underground, where they mutate and inevitably find another way to demand your attention. Imagine a dedicated professional who prides themselves on never getting upset, perpetually swallowing their daily frustrations to keep the peace. Eventually, those unexpressed emotions set up camp in the physical body. The buried stress becomes a chronic, agonizing backache, a sudden onset of digestive issues, or a relentless tension headache. The suppressed anger ferments in the dark until it randomly explodes, causing the person to unleash a furious tirade over a minor, insignificant inconvenience like a spilled cup of coffee or a delayed train. They are left utterly mystified by their own explosive behavior, wondering why their life feels so strangely hollow and chaotic. The only way to disarm these underground explosions is to begin the brave, delicate work of bringing your feelings into the light. You must learn to name them. There is a profound, almost magical power in simply stating, "I am feeling deeply sad right now," or "I am feeling terrified." Putting a word to a sensation takes an overwhelming, invisible ghost and transforms it into a tangible object that you can actually hold and examine. It shifts the experience from a terrifying internal chaos into something you can manage. To build this muscle, you must deliberately practice the art of turning your attention inward. Imagine finding a completely quiet room where you can sit alone and close your eyes. In your mind, envision a massive blank movie screen, intentionally sweeping away the frantic, racing thoughts of your daily to-do list. Focus your entire being on that blank screen and ask yourself one simple, piercing question. What am I feeling right now? Initially, the screen might remain stubbornly blank. You might feel a profound urge to get up and distract yourself, finding the silence unbearable. But if you sit patiently, a word might slowly materialize. Perhaps it is a quiet, heavy loneliness. Perhaps it is a sharp, vibrant frustration. Once you have identified the word, you must take the next courageous step and ask, why? Why is this feeling visiting me right now? Has a recent interaction brought up an old familiar ache? Is this a lingering sorrow from something that happened yesterday, or is it an ancient grief rising from the past? This process is the ultimate mechanics of true change. It is not about snapping your fingers and suddenly becoming perfectly happy. It is about patiently, persistently learning the vocabulary of your own heart. By repeatedly turning your gaze inward, naming the invisible forces within you and asking where they come from, you are slowly rewiring the very foundation of your mind. You are reclaiming the brilliant, necessary fuel that makes life vibrant, rich, and undeniably real. Chapter 7. The Language of Connection. Imagine holding an intricate, antique compass that you have been told your entire life is fundamentally broken. You have learned to navigate the treacherous landscapes of your life without it, relying instead on maps drawn by other people, constantly second-guessing your direction and frequently finding yourself lost. When you finally begin the brave work of turning your attention inward and naming your emotions, it is exactly like realizing that compass works perfectly. However, because you have spent decades believing it was flawed, your very first instinct will likely be to judge the directions it gives you. You might uncover a deep, burning resentment or a profound, overwhelming sorrow and immediately recoil in shame, convinced that feeling such things makes you a terrible person. There is a pervasive, damaging myth in our culture that human emotions carry a moral weight. We eagerly categorize joy, gratitude, and peacefulness as inherently good, while we banish anger, jealousy, and despair into the dark, treating them as moral failures. The absolute truth is that there is no such thing as a bad emotion. Feelings themselves are completely neutral. They are simply messengers delivering vital dispatches from your internal world. Anger is not inherently evil. It is the natural, healthy alarm bell that sounds when a boundary has been crossed or an injustice has occurred. Deep sorrow is not a sign of pathetic weakness. It is the physical manifestation of your capacity to love and the pain of losing something that mattered. You must learn to separate the raw emotion from the action it might inspire. You can be consumed by absolute rage without ever raising your voice or throwing a stone. You must stop judging yourself for the weather passing through your internal sky, and instead begin paying attention to what it is trying to tell you. To truly harness the rich fuel of your own heart, you must move through a deliberate, courageous internal progression. First, you must clearly identify the feeling as it rises, calling it by its true name. Second, you must accept it unconditionally, fighting the urge to judge it, dismiss it, or immediately bury it under a distraction. Once you have accepted its presence, you must act as a compassionate detective, tracing the emotion back to its roots to understand exactly why it has arrived at your door. You ask yourself what recent interaction, passing memory, or unspoken fear triggered this specific wave of feeling. Once you have identified and accepted the messenger, you face the most terrifying step of all, bringing that internal reality into the external world. This requires the delicate, powerful balance of fierce honesty and profound compassion. Imagine you have just endured an incredibly unfair public reprimand from a superior at work, right before stepping out to enjoy a long-awaited evening with a cherished partner. Your lifelong survival instinct will scream at you to swallow the humiliation. You will smile tightly, insist you are perfectly fine, and desperately try to force a cheerful demeanor. But the buried anger will inevitably leak out. You will likely spend the evening feeling distant, snapping at minor inconveniences, and leaving your partner entirely bewildered, assuming they have done something wrong to ruin the night. Now imagine the profound alternative. You step into the evening and choose not to hide. You look at your partner, mindful of their excitement. and you speak your truth with gentle precision. You say that you are incredibly glad to be with them, but you are carrying a heavy, unexpected frustration from your day, and you simply need a moment to set it down before you can fully enjoy the night. You share the story of the reprimand, not asking them to solve it, but simply asking them to witness your hurt. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, a miracle occurs. The toxic weight of the humiliation immediately begins to dissipate because it is no longer trapped in the dark. Your partner feels deeply trusted and valued, and your bond thickens. By speaking the language of connection, you have taken a moment that could have driven a wedge between you and transformed it into a bridge. This level of vulnerability strikes at the very core of a devastating lie carried by those who are raised in an emotional vacuum. It is the secret, suffocating belief that your true feelings are an unbearable burden to other people. You have likely spent your entire life assuming that if you ever stopped being endlessly accommodating and cheerfully low maintenance, the people you love would instantly scatter. You believe that sharing your pain is an imposition, and that revealing your cracked edges makes you fundamentally unlovable. This assumption feels like an absolute undeniable fact, but it is nothing more than a ghost story written by the environment of your youth. To dismantle this lie, you must commit to a radical, terrifying experiment. You must consciously choose to do the exact opposite of what your childhood programming dictates. The next time you are struggling, instead of retreating into your familiar, isolated fortress, you must force yourself to reach out. You must deliberately tell a trusted friend that you are feeling overwhelmed, and then simply watch what happens. You will discover that the sky does not fall. Your friend will not recoil in horror, nor will they suddenly view you as a pathetic burden. In fact, you will likely see an immediate softening in their eyes. By dropping your armor, you grant them permission to drop theirs. You will realize that mutual need is not a weakness. It is the very gravity that holds human beings together. As you learn to speak this new, vibrant language of connection, you must also learn how to listen for it in others. Most human conversation skates entirely on the secure, predictable surface of life. We ask people what they did over the weekend, what time their flight arrived, or how their meeting went. This surface-level exchange is completely necessary for managing the logistics of daily life, but it cannot sustain a hungry heart. It is the equivalent of reading the table of contents and claiming you understand the entire novel. To build genuine, unbreakable intimacy, you must learn to drop a plumb line into the depths of another human being. You must shift your curiosity downward. When a loved one returns from a difficult visit with an ailing relative, you do not simply ask what time they arrived or what they ate for lunch. You look them in the eye and ask what the hardest part of the afternoon was for them. You ask them what they are carrying, and then you sit quietly and allow them the space to answer. You do not rush to fix their pain, offer platitudes, or change the subject to something more comfortable. You simply bear witness to their reality. This profound exchange of emotional truth is the antidote to the echoing numbness of an empty tank. It is the ultimate realization that we were never meant to carry the unbearable weight of life alone. But before we can fully extend this profound grace to the world around us, we must first learn how to turn it inward, building an unbreakable architecture of care for ourselves. Chapter 8. The Architecture of Self-Care. Imagine a beautifully designed house with sturdy walls and elegant windows, but absolutely no roof. No matter how much warmth is generated inside, it immediately escapes into the atmosphere, and every passing storm pours directly into the living room. The structure cannot protect its inhabitants, nor can it sustain itself. The same is true for a human being who gives endlessly to the world, but possesses no internal architecture to protect their own energy. Adults who grew up in emotional drafts often view their own needs as completely invisible. They become magnificent, tireless caretakers of everyone else, anticipating the desires of their partners, their children, and their colleagues, yet they leave their own inner world completely unattended. To build a sustainable life, you must learn the profound art of self-nurturance. If you were raised to be fiercely accommodating, putting yourself first will initially feel like an act of supreme, unforgivable selfishness. But imagine trying to pour life-giving water from a pitcher that has been dry for years. You cannot sustain the people around you if your own reserves have turned to dust. The very first brick in the architecture of self-care is learning to assert a boundary without manufacturing an elaborate excuse. You might be the person who takes on every extra assignment at work, or the friend who drops everything to absorb someone else's crisis, leaving yourself with nothing but scraps of exhaustion. The first time you say no, it will likely feel like a betrayal, and the people accustomed to your endless accommodation might push back. You must stand firm. Saying no to a draining request is how you say yes to your own survival. Simultaneously, you must learn to dismantle the terrifying trap of asking for help. If you exist in a reality where you feel completely incapable of saying no to others, you naturally assume that everyone else operates under the exact same paralyzing guilt. Therefore, you never ask anyone for a favor, terrified that you will trap them into a resentful obligation. You must realize that other people possess the healthy ability to decline a request. By refusing to ask for support, you are denying the people who love you the profound privilege of being there for you. Beyond boundaries, there is the quiet, devastating tragedy of not knowing what you actually enjoy. If you were raised in an environment where your preferences were never requested or celebrated, you might reach middle age completely mystified by your own tastes. Picture an adult standing in a clothing store or staring at a restaurant menu, suddenly gripped by paralysis. For decades, they have simply ordered the meal that is easiest to share, or worn the colors that draw the absolute least attention to themselves. To care for yourself, you must begin the deliberate work of curiosity. You must ask yourself what music truly moves you, what hobbies make you lose track of time, and what flavors you genuinely crave, and then you must elevate those desires to a place of priority without a single drop of guilt. This internal architecture must also be supported by physical pillars. When caregivers fail to model a healthy relationship with food, movement, and rest, a child is left to blindly program themselves. Consider a highly successful professional whose diet still consists entirely of convenient fast food or childhood snacks, simply because no one ever taught them that preparing fresh, nourishing food is a fundamental act of self-respect. Or consider the complex relationship with rest. You might be the person who works feverishly until total physical collapse, viewing sleep as a frustrating inconvenience. Conversely, you might be someone who retreats to bed for days to avoid the friction of the world. True rest is not a panicked escape, nor is it a conditional luxury earned only through exhaustion. It is a vital, daily rhythm that must be regulated by a firm, loving internal parent. This brings us to the mortar that holds the entire structure together: self-discipline. We frequently view discipline as a harsh, punishing whip, but true self-discipline is the ultimate act of self-love. If you were raised with an absence of structure, or if the rules in your home were entirely erratic, you never internalized the ability to govern your own impulses. You might find yourself staring at a pile of unpaid bills or a mounting creative project, feeling entirely paralyzed. You surrender to the immediate comfort of a distraction, only to crush yourself hours later with a brutal, vicious internal monologue calling yourself lazy and worthless. Genuine self-discipline is not about punishment, it is the profound act of making yourself do what is necessary today so that you can be safe, proud, and free tomorrow. To rebuild this muscle, you must engage in a quiet daily rebellion against your own default settings. You must practice the deliberate art of overriding your impulses. Think of choosing to stand up and tackle a tedious, unpleasant chore the exact moment you notice yourself desperately trying to avoid it. Think of gently but firmly walking away from an immediate, unhealthy indulgence that you know will make you feel hollow later. It does not matter how small or mundane the action is, the magic is in the mechanics of making the choice. With every conscious decision to override a destructive impulse, you are laying a new brick. You are slowly, painstakingly constructing a fortress of self-respect, ensuring that the vessel carrying you through this world is finally treated with the absolute devotion it has always deserved. Chapter 9. The Art of Deep Compassion. Every human being walking this earth will eventually encounter a storm. Life, by its very nature, guarantees moments of profound disappointment, sudden loss, and overwhelming stress. When the sky darkens and the emotional winds begin to howl, the most crucial question is not how to stop the storm, but how you seek shelter. For those who were raised in an environment of emotional scarcity, the concept of internal shelter simply does not exist. When a sudden wave of panic or sadness hits, they do not know how to calm their own racing heart. Consider how a deeply attuned caregiver reacts to a terrified child who wakes up trembling from a vivid nightmare. The caregiver does not yell at the child for waking them up, nor do they dismiss the fear as illogical and foolish. They sit on the edge of the bed, gently smooth the child's hair, speak in a low, rhythmic whisper, and stay present until the child's breathing slows and the terror recedes. The child absorbs this physical and emotional comfort like a sponge, internalizing the profound lesson that distress is temporary and that they are entirely safe. They carry this internal soothing presence with them into adulthood. But if you were left to cry alone in the dark, you never learned how to de-escalate your own nervous system. You enter the adult world completely improvising your own comfort. Imagine a dedicated professional who has poured months of their soul into a creative presentation, only to have it casually dismissed by a superior in front of a crowded room. As they return to their desk, a hot, suffocating wave of shame and anxiety washes over them. Because they possess no internal mechanism for comfort, their immediate instinct is either destructive escape or brutal self-punishment. They might frantically consume sugary food, pour heavily from a bottle of spirits the moment they return home, or spend the entire night staring at the ceiling, replaying the humiliation on an endless, agonizing loop. They are entirely at the mercy of their own emotional turbulence. To survive the storms of life, you must deliberately build your own shelter before the rain begins to fall. You cannot wait until you are drowning in a crisis to figure out how to swim. You must intentionally curate a repertoire of healthy, restorative practices that physically and mentally ground you. This might be the simple, sensory shock of a hot shower washing away the tension of a brutal day. It might be the rhythmic, physical exertion of a long, solitary run, or the focused, meditative act of preparing a complex meal with your own hands. It requires paying acute attention to what truly brings your heart rate down, recognizing that the very act of seeking comfort is a profound declaration of your own worth. The most powerful tool in this entire shelter, however, is the invisible, silent dialogue you hold with yourself. Self-talk is the ultimate anchor in a turbulent sea. When the panic rises, you must learn to speak to yourself with steady, unyielding reassurance. You look inward and deliberately remind yourself that a feeling is just a feeling, and feelings do not last forever. You remind yourself that you have survived every single bad day you have ever faced. You become the calming presence in your own dark room. This practice of soothing inevitably leads to the absolute highest pinnacle of human healing, profound, unwavering self-compassion. If self-soothing is the shelter, self-compassion is the bedrock it is built upon. It is the radiant, transformative ability to extend the exact same grace to yourself that you so freely give to the world. There is a tragic paradox that haunts those who grew up running on empty. They are often the most magnificent, empathetic listeners in their social circles, offering brilliant, non-judgmental wisdom to anyone who is hurting. Yet, the moment they make an honest human error, they unleash an internal tyrant. Picture a fiercely loving parent who accidentally forgets a crucial deadline, causing a major logistical nightmare for a highly anticipated family trip. The moment the realization hits, their internal monologue becomes vicious. They silently attack themselves, calling themselves incompetent, unreliable, and an absolute failure. Now imagine if their absolute best friend had made the exact same error. Would they look their friend in the eye and call them a worthless failure? Of course not. They would instantly offer perspective, reminding their friend of how much they juggle and assuring them that a simple oversight does not define their character. The ultimate breakthrough occurs when you finally demand that same standard of kindness for yourself. You must cultivate an internal voice that is deeply loving yet undeniably firm. When you make a mistake, this new voice does not let you off the hook completely by ignoring the issue, nor does it brutally crush your spirit. It acts as a wise, steady mentor. It acknowledges the error calmly, assesses exactly what went wrong without assigning toxic blame, and determines how to prevent it in the future. Once the lesson is extracted, this voice does the most miraculous thing of all. It forgives you, and it insists that you move on. It embraces the magnificent, non-negotiable reality that you are a flawed, breathing human being, and that your mistakes are simply the price of admission to a deeply lived life. When you finally wrap yourself in this profound compassion, you stop fighting a war against your own humanity, and you finally, truly come home to yourself. Chapter 10. Breaking the Generational Cycle. There is a fierce, almost desperate vow that many people make the moment they look at their own child, a silent promise to never repeat the mistakes of the past. When you finally realize that your own emotional tank has been running on empty for decades, your immediate reaction as a parent might be a wave of absolute crushing terror. You might look at your children and feel a sudden, heavy guilt, terrified that you have unknowingly passed this invisible void down to the people you love more than life itself. The very first crucial step in breaking this generational cycle is to take that guilt, acknowledge its presence, and then completely let it go. Guilt is not a requirement for good parenting. In fact, it actively undermines your strength. When you parent from a place of guilt, you become paralyzed. You second-guess your boundaries, you struggle to say no, and you inadvertently teach your children how to manipulate your self-doubt. You must replace that exhausting guilt with a quiet, powerful accountability. You cannot teach a language you were never taught to speak, and you cannot give your child what you do not have yourself. The magnificent truth about children is that they are deeply, wonderfully resilient, absorbing the environment around them like sponges. They absorb the absences, yes, but they also eagerly soak up the sudden presence of warmth, boundaries, and emotional truth. The moment you begin to do the heavy, beautiful work of filling your own tank, your children will begin to drink from that new premium fuel. As you learn to value your own needs, set boundaries, and name your feelings, the atmosphere in your home will fundamentally shift. Your children might push back at first, confused by your new boundaries and your sudden willingness to say no, but beneath their temporary frustration, they are absorbing a profound lesson. They are watching you value yourself, which gives them the permanent, unspoken permission to value themselves. To ensure the cycle stops with you, you must deliberately translate the lessons of your own recovery into your daily parenting. If you grew up fiercely independent, terrified of relying on anyone, you must consciously model mutual interdependence for your children. You must teach them that it is entirely safe to lean on other people, demonstrating this by stepping in to offer them warm, competent help when they truly need it, while stepping back to let them struggle when they are capable of finding their own way. If you grew up with a fractured, unrealistic sense of your own identity, you must become a clear, flawless mirror for your child. You do this not by demanding perfection, but by quietly paying attention to who they actually are. You reflect their true strengths with pride, and you help them contextualize their weaknesses without an ounce of shaming. You give them the gift of truly being seen, so that they enter adulthood knowing exactly what they are capable of. When your child inevitably makes a mistake or fails at a task, you have the profound opportunity to reverse the golden rule. You must do unto your child as you desperately wish your parents had done unto you. Instead of reacting with sudden anger or cold disappointment, you step in and help them untangle their error. You hold them accountable, certainly, but you also help them separate their inherent worth from their temporary failure. You walk them through the process of understanding what went wrong, figuring out how to fix it, and then, most importantly, you teach them how to completely forgive themselves and leave the mistake in the past. By offering them this deep, structured compassion, you ensure that they never develop the devastating internal tyrant that has haunted your own mind. Perhaps the greatest challenge you will face is dealing with the raw, unpredictable force of your child's emotions. A child's feelings are like a rushing river. If you try to build a sudden wall to stop the water, it will simply flood the banks or reverse its course, turning inward and mutating into shame. You cannot stop a child's feelings, and you must never try to shame them into silence. Instead, you must let the water flow while you gently seek the source. You must pay acute attention to what they are experiencing, make a deliberate effort to feel it alongside them, and give them the vocabulary to express it. You must ask them profound, probing questions that direct their gaze inward, and you must weave emotional language into the everyday fabric of your home. By doing this, you are teaching them that their feelings are not a disease to be cured, but a vital, beautiful part of their humanity. For generations, society has focused entirely on the visible wounds of childhood, the obvious acts of cruelty, the loud traumas, and the undeniable abuses. The quiet, devastating acts of omission have been universally ignored, leaving millions of people to wander through their adult lives wondering why they feel so hollow. Recognizing the profound impact of what did not happen to you is incredibly intimidating. It forces you to acknowledge the immense power that caregivers hold over a developing mind, which can make you feel terrifyingly vulnerable both as a child and as a parent. But stepping into that vulnerability is the only way to dismantle the invisible force that has held you back. You are standing at a monumental crossroads. You have the power to take the inadequate hand you were dealt and completely reshuffle the deck for the next generation. Ending the legacy of emotional invisibility is not merely an act of self-improvement, it is an act of profound, echoing heroism. It is the most loving, challenging, and enriching work you will ever undertake. As you pour this premium, hard-won fuel into the hearts of the people you love, you will feel the emptiness within yourself finally begin to close. You will become the truest, most connected version of yourself, and in doing so you will grant your children the ultimate freedom to become the same.